you could be forgiven for asking what is this thing, for not recognizing it as a turntable. And that's what it is. It's our new K3 turntable, which obviously does not look like any other turntable ever made. And there's a lot of reasons and stories behind that. There's a lot behind this whole thing. In fact, it's way too much to put into one video, so we'll break this up into a number of videos. For example, just the tonearm will have a video. I'd like to take an overview of this. This is by far the most expensive, difficult, time-consuming project that we've ever embarked upon. This took fully 7 years from starting it to having it done, which was in October of last year. I'd say October of last year, because that's when this came out. Michael Fremer was kind enough to give it an extremely good review, and he actually bought his production prototype example. So this was on the cover October of 21, and the review is basically, the world's best turntable ever. But it's an extremely iconoclastic design, both aesthetically and in terms of the mechanics, the engineering of it, all of which I'd like to go into, because it was an incredible journey for me, for us, to do this. Maybe it's interesting to explain why did we even conceive of making something like this. And it's really quite simple. And that's because, we make speakers, amplifiers, the audio furniture. Well, we also needed the source. We needed, since we don't do digital, I needed a really great turntable. And I personally had been using idler drive, mainly professional idler drive turntables, but also things like Gerard 301s, 401s, and direct drive turntables. And when I started OMA, there was no way that I was going to ever, have or use or make anything that had to do with a belt drive turntable. Now, I think I've spent time on other videos and blogs and things talking about how I feel about belt drive. I consider belt drive turntables to be pretty much, not to be fancied up, a joke. Belt drive turntables are not serious engineering. You can make them as big as you can stretch your arms. You can make them weigh 800 pounds. You can make them have 200-pound platters, all of which actually describe a turntable that you can buy now for $500,000. But they're still what they are. A turntable that cannot properly reproduce the element of time in music. And that's what we wanted to do with this turntable. Idler drives, I really love idler drives, but idler drive turntables pose a really big problem if you're a small manufacturer. And that is that the super high quality synchronous hysteresis motors that were used on decks like the Thorns 124, the Gerard 301, the Gerard 401, Commonwealth, EMT, these motors don't exist any longer. Nobody makes any motor like that. And to go to a company like Pabst, which made one of the best, the Außenlaufer motors, of which I have still quite a large inventory, new old stock. In fact, those motors are being used in a $500,000 turntable today, a 60-year-old motor that you can buy for 50 or 100 bucks. Unfortunately, you can't get these motors made today unless you were going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to have a company make you new ones using the old, precedents. So that kind of means that idler drive turntables are not really a serious proposition. But initially, I was thinking about doing a professional level idler drive turntable using a brand new motor. And I started looking around at the state of the art for motors, for example. But meanwhile, the SP10 motor units, which we had been buying used and then refurbishing and restoring, these are excellent motor units. Technic started making the SP10 again, and I've done videos on the SP10, so you can look that up and you can see the plinth system we made for that. But we were taking the original SP10 motor units and basically hot rodding them. And the fellow who did the work on the refurbishment is a real expert in this subject, Bill Thalman. He told me one day when we were talking about some work that he was doing for us, about this guy, Richard Krebs in New Zealand. So I'll just make a little Krebs section here. And I'd heard about this modification that this man had come up with for the SP10. It was quite pricey, but people were saying good things about it. And Bill said, Jonathan, you need to try this because it's remarkable. And I'm thinking, I'm not really into this whole DIY modification thing, the tweaking thing. He says, just try it. If you don't like it, I won't even charge you for it. And I get an SP10 back that had this Krebs modification, and I was just like, this is nuts. This is like a totally different turntable. I couldn't believe how much better the SP10 that Krebs modification had done, how that sounded. So I reach out to this guy. He's an engineer and very successful businessman who owns a big hydraulics, I think the biggest hydraulics engineering company and manufacturing company in New Zealand and maybe Australia. And we started talking, we hit it off. And it occurred to me, this guy is by far and away the world's top expert, maybe the world's only expert in professional direct drive, turntable, engineering, history, technology. He knew every, important direct drive turntable, all the Japanese super decks, and had studied them and figured out how they worked and how to improve them, the historical ones, which that was what his modification was. And then I thought, instead of doing an idler drive, new turntable, maybe Richard would be interested in creating a new direct drive turntable with me. So I said, hey, would this be interesting? And he jumped at the prospect. He said, I'm not interested in creating new audio products to sell them myself. I don't want to be involved in the audio business. But he said, my whole life I've always wanted to engineer a direct drive turntable from scratch. And knowing OMA, if we would be the ones behind it, he would sign on to that. So began a 7-year collaboration, which continues to this day, because we're working on something that follows after this. And that has been an unbelievable journey and has been, thank heavens, super successful, because this really did turn out to be not just the best direct drive turntable or the best current. This is a complete rethinking of the turntable. Nothing short of that. And I'd like to go into the various aspects of that as opposed to just making unwarranted claims. So the design inspiration for this was professional cutting lathes that were used to cut the lacquer, that master, and we were just at Josh Bonatti's facility, Bonatti Mastering, where he has a Neumann VMS 70 cutting lathe, which is an incredible, beautiful machine. And I acquired various historical cutting lathes in the process of this project, and we'll look at some of them. But cutting lathes, professional machines that were laboratory grade, precision instruments functioning at nanometer precision tolerance to actually cut records, to make records. So it seemed to me that if you want to make the best possible turntable, you're not going to make a cutting lathe, but following the precedents, and I was also interested, maybe we could even add a cutting arm to our turntable because it would have an immensely powerful motor. We knew that from the get-go. Now, we didn't go that direction, but we did end up with a form factor that actually is closer to cutting lathes. If you look at Neumann, Scully, universal lathes, this looks more like those than it does any historical turntables, either consumer turntables or professional transcription, meaning like studio turntables, broadcast turntables. This structure really harks back to the age of very beautifully made, ultra-high precision, and often Swiss milling machines and lathes used for small parts, watches, for example, and the use of cast iron plays into that because these types of industrial machines, tools, instruments were almost always made out of cast iron because that was a material that had the density, the stability, the rigidity, and the damping to allow the machine to function properly. And when it comes to turntables, of course, I don't think anybody's made a cast iron turntable. I'm sure somebody has someplace, but I don't know of one. And there's a lot of reasons not to make one out of cast iron because it's not the simplest, cheapest thing to do. And that's the thing. When you look at just about all turntables that are made up until recently, they were all made, the design is not about the form follows function. The design is about how do we make this thing as cheaply as possible so we make the most profit and then we're making money. This wasn't designed that way. That's also why this thing is extremely expensive. It's extremely expensive because we have to cover the incredibly high costs of making it, and then I probably will never see the R&D back, although I certainly hope Richard does see it. The cast iron structure was also necessary to do what you can't see inside of here, all right? From the outside, besides these grooves, which are purely decorative, it's a very simple structure. Inside, it's not simple. Inside, it's a labyrinth of cavities that connect to each other, not arbitrarily, I can tell you. And in these cavities is a mixture of a specialty weight soil and particle mixture, which the two of them, they damp any vibration resonance that comes either from outside, like from the speakers, or from the motor itself. And the motor itself is very, very, very quiet. But inside of here, if you could see X-ray style, you would see all sorts of chambers that are filled with this material of liquid and solid. The reason that you have these gold plugs here, and they are plugs here and here, is because inside of the platter and inside of the arm board, there is the same chambers. These are more now like spokes of a wheel and like test tubes in diameter, and they're filled with a liquid solid mixture also and plugged up, again, to dampen anything happening vibration-wise in the platter or in the arm board. To dynamically balance a platter, and this platter also has layers of various metals that are bonded together on the underside to create the right damping of the platter. This was extremely difficult to do. The whole thing presents an extremely well damped, and I want to use the term now, critical damping, because we'll discuss that more over the course of these videos. So you can make this whole thing out of lead, you know, or the heaviest rubber, or you can make things that are extremely dead. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is you want to damp the resonances that are the problem and leave the rest to be, you know, as it is. I mean, you don't want it to be all lively, but you don't want the thing to be dead. You want your damping to occur the places where it's needed and nowhere else. That's critical damping. In the audio world, I don't see people discussing the concept of critical damping. They talk about how damped and quiet something is, but then what happens is it sounds dead. This is not a dead sounding turntable. It's an extremely lifelike deck, and that's because what we did is we got it to be extremely quiet in terms of vibration resonance. The structure of it, it's about 300 pounds of cast iron and metal in this, which is, you know, actually the competitors are up in the 500-600 pound range, but they also sound dead. Richard and I spent years trying to find the right motor for this direct drive system, and this was a very, very interesting part of the project and the search, because what we're really buying is ultra advanced stator and rotor. You can't buy a motor for this, and we'll go into that in a moment. You're buying really motor parts. And the stator and rotor that we're using in this don't even really, if you put them in your hand, they don't weigh that much. They have extraordinarily powerful neodymium magnets and a coreless structure. I don't know if I'm getting all the details correct, but these motors are the most advanced motors that human beings have ever made for this type of application, this size. They are just unbelievably sophisticated because they are designed, and the company that makes this motor, when I asked them what else uses this motor, they said, well, deep space telescopes, you know, the kind that cost like billions of dollars, that have to be positioned to incredible precision. The anti-ballistic missile system for the U.S. military uses this exact motor to shoot down, little Rocket Man's nuclear weapons from North Korea, for example. Photolithography machine bases on machines that are working at nano precision. Essentially, the cheapest thing that uses this motor, besides this turntable, it's about $80 million. So we started out with these motor parts, but then we had to build our own motor structure. So it's now, behooves me to talk about how a direct drive turntable really works. And this also explains why the turntable has the form it does, right? So a direct drive turntable, the platter is actually part of the motor system, right? So there's a stator and a rotor, and the stator is mounted to the bottom of this casting, and the rotor is mounted to the shaft, the bearing shaft, that terminates in the platter, right? So as this moves, one rotation. The motor down below, the stator and the rotor, move one rotation. So it's one thing. And the bearing shaft, platter at the top, and the motor parts at the bottom, is this long, is fully an inch in diameter of a hardened alloy of steel. I'm not going to go into what. And the bearing sleeve is a type of new material. I believe it was developed for weapons during like Desert Storm, where sand would get into guns and things. They wanted a material that required no lubrication, would last forever, and wouldn't get screwed up by any particles or things like this. This material doesn't require any lubrication at all. We put in a special weight of oil into that bearing shaft, sleeve, I should say, so that it actually gives additional drag to the system. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. This is an ultra sophisticated bearing motor assembly which terminates at the platter. It's an inverted bearing. There's a bowl at the top. And then the bearing shaft running in the sleeve, there's a column of oil inside of here, which I mentioned is really a preload. It's not a lubrication. And I can't show you that, but actually, so there's the oil film. This column of oil that is lubricating and pre-dragging the shaft, it's pressurized ingeniously, not with no pump. Another one of Richard Krebs's sort of genius design features, so that you have this pressurized column of oil in there, which is permanent. Okay, so what we developed, what we were after, was the most powerful motor possible, even though we don't need all that power. So we wanted a motor that any modulation of the stylus and the groove, the motor just wouldn't even see it. So, we can talk a little bit about these design parameters, and I have done this in some other videos, like on the SP10, but, essentially what happens when you're playing a record, needle's in there in the groove, it's playing, right? And the pianist, is being recorded, hits hard, gets loud, big groove, stylus, point in the groove is going along, and that presents like a break on the system, right? So if the motor and the system that senses speed just goes ha, you just keep going. You don't slow down. But a belt drive turntable, all belt drive turntables, every single belt drive turntable ever made, whether the platter is 1 ounce or the platter is 150,000 pounds, it will slow down. And there's no way to speed it up in time because it's on a lossy belt. So by the time any sensing apparatus in a belt drive motor senses that something's slowed down, it's too late. You've already heard the note. This is pretty much common sense. So if you have an incredibly powerful motor, which you tune correctly, it doesn't slow down. If it doesn't slow down, you have correct speed. If you have correct speed, when you listen to somebody playing the piano, it sounds like a piano, if it's well recorded. It's very simple. It's extremely difficult, virtually impossible to do. This turntable, the project was, what we really wanted to do is actually answer a question for ourselves. what would the ultimate vinyl playback sound like? Again, don't want to jump ahead of myself, but that's what we wanted to find out. And if the speed stability wasn't absolutely perfect, then we wouldn't be able to know the answer to the question. The creation of the motor from a physical standpoint, from the physical engineering standpoint, was difficult to do, very difficult to do. Again, the reason that the depth is what it is because we had a bearing where we wanted to locate the motor, which has the electromagnetic, parts down here, away from the sensitive stylus. Every direct drive motor system that's been made so far, the platter and the motor parts are very close. That means the EMF, the electromagnetic radiation from the motor, which can be considerable, can possibly interfere with the magnetic system in the cartridge. So it's a very deep, long bearing with the motor located quite far away. The motor, these types of motors, they do not come with, they don't come with a power supply, and they don't come with any kind of control. You have to actually design the control. And that turned into a project that Richard and his team in New Zealand spent, I think, over 1,100 hours programming this motor. So when you get to the fact that I've got between 1,500 and 2,000 hours in this project, and Richard's got 1,100 hours just in programming the motor, you can start to see how big a job this was. And I haven't asked Frank how many hours he has in designing this arm. You have an idea about how much work went into creating K3. Well, actually, why is it called K3? Because we had K, K1, K2, K3. This is not the first of these turntables. This is the third or fourth iteration of the design. So there's several of these that look different in existence, but this is what we decided to go into production with. The motor programming was a really difficult thing to do, because when you're, if you're familiar with these kind of direct drive turntables, how do you get the motor to tell the thing, to tell the platter, how to adjust speed without that itself being audible? And then we get into the big problem with direct drive turntables historically, because they always had problems with the control mechanism sort of changing the sound of the turntable, sort of bleaching the sound of the system, because typically the control mechanisms were very tightly regulating the speed, checking it all the time and controlling it, and you could kind of hear that. In fact, it's not you could hear it. And what happened in the course of programming the motor is that Richard and his team started to become more and more granular in their approach to time. And they went from programming at arc minutes to arc seconds and fractions of arc seconds. And in the end, they were programming down to fractions of an arc second. They were programming down to basically millionths of a second. And they were hearing it, because they were doing this both in terms of test mathematics and double-blind listening tests. So at all stages through this process, there was both the proper engineering being done, simulations, the math, tests, and then there was listening. Didn't mention the fact that we also took this to Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, and they had offered their help, their physics and engineering department, in doing simulations of this and the platter. And that was a year-long project for both their faculty and for their graduate students. And in the end, they gave us an award. They gave us their innovation award for, I think, 2018 or 2019. The most innovative thing that Bucknell worked on for that year was this turntable. I'm pretty proud of that. So the programming of the motor was a major challenge. The speccing and design and creation of the motor, obviously the thing is running at such precision that everything has to really be done perfectly inside of there. That was a major challenge. The casting of the actual chassis was beyond a challenge. At times I wondered whether it was actually even possible, because we started with 3D printed molds. They didn't work. The holes inside kept casting wrong. We went through dozens of castings to get this correct. And it wasn't until the end that I even really felt confident that we would be able to do it at all. Then there was, just how to finish it. So what I wanted was this cast surface, like a Swiss lathe, where you could see this rough cast surface from the mold, and including sometimes imperfections. It's part of the cast process. And this turned out to be extremely difficult to do, because the surface is often marred by imperfections, so it's only 1 out of every 10 of these castings that we can use. And then finishing it, the thing weighs hundreds of pounds, and how do you finish it? First, it has to have these grooves machined into it, and then our finishing guy, he has to blast it and burnish it, and then coat it with a ceramic, very high-tech ceramic coating, which is used for things like weapons, firearms, and high-performance exhausts and wheels. Very, very demanding applications. So it's both the black and the clear are ceramic coatings. And then the top was also quite a bit of a problem, because we wanted to give it a finish, but it has, you can see all the graphite crystals in the casting, and we had to figure out a way to polish it to, where those wouldn't pull out and give us a good finish. I wanted the thing to look good. But the machining was probably the most difficult thing of all, because this casting, comes from the foundry and then goes to the machine shop, and it's ISO 2000. It's like the highest level of like aerospace machine type shop, and they have to figure out a way to fixture this in their CNC machine, not once, but many times. So this is an aspect to the design and build of this turntable that's difficult for people to fathom who are not making things, but I'll try to explain it as simply as possible. When you're dealing with any of the other high-end turntables or any of these machined objects, right, what happens is a big chunk of metal is put into the bed of a CNC machine, okay? It can be aluminum, it could be steel. And then the machine comes and finds a reference point and starts carving away like it's Michelangelo, with all sorts of bits and tips and tools. And it's taking off metal and going in and you know, it's removing material, okay? And when you're done, it's all freshly machined on the outside and on the inside. The doors open, now you can go through the next process of finishing. That's not what happens with this. Because this finish, this surface, right, from the foundry, we wanted it to look like that all, you know, from the foundry to you having it in your house. But it has to go into this machine, and the machine has to find a reference point and do all of these operations, not once, but like 4 or 5 times, because it has to get machine going in, then it gets turned, machine this way, then turn, and each time it has to be held in place to incredible precision so the machine knows where to take the material away from, all the while not screwing it up cosmetically. This took an insane amount of time and effort to figure out with the machine shop. Thank you to our machinists who collaborated with us and really saw the value in this project and made it happen, because they had incredible patience, and I know that this was a difficult thing and a very unusual thing for them, because that's not, you know, machine shops don't really care about the cosmetics of things. So this was very, very difficult to make and to design, to fabricate, to do the engineering on. And then I worked with Anna Gujic, one of our industrial designers. She's in Rome. And she worked with me on the exterior of the chassis. She created the stand, which I'm not going to talk about today, and, you know, gave it this simple elegance, which puts it, you know, stands it apart from the other turntables that I see in the sort of hyper turntable market segment. And those, you can actually identify them from a mile away, because they're all kind of like way bigger than they need to be, and they have all sorts of stuff coming off of them, which are there to tell you how complicated it is, how expensive it is, but it's still a belt drive turntable, meaning where's the beef? We went the opposite direction on this, which is, how do we make this as simple, as clean as possible, and as transparent to its industrial predecessors, cutting lathes, as we could get. So I think that's enough for this segment. I haven't even discussed like how it sort of works, speed selector, things like this. That'll come next. But I wanted to give an overview of K3. I think that was a pretty good start.